Hi, my name is Lizzie Casciola, and I'm a research scientist here at HERC, the Houston Education Research Consortium, which is a research practice partnership between Rice University and 11 public school districts in and around the Houston area. Thanks for joining me as I present some recent results examining predictors of a campus's percent of English learners, or ELs, who go on to become long-term English learners, or LTELs. The specific research question under investigation is what campus characteristics and neighborhood factors are associated with a campus's percent of ELs who go on to become LTELs. We define a campus's percent of ELs who become LTEL as the percent of EL students who begin at an elementary campus and go on to become LTEL. In this study, we define a long-term English learner as an EL student who does not reclassify as English proficient after 5 years in school. Therefore, for each elementary school in the Houston area, we identify the number of students who began first grade or year one as ELs at each campus, and the percent of ELs who did not reclassify 5 years later and began sixth grade as ELs made up the campus's percent of ELs who became LTEL. To preview our findings, elementary campuses with the higher percent of ELs who went on to become LTELs were characterized by 4 key factors. Specifically, a higher percent of students in bilingual and ESL programs at that campus, a higher percent of residents in a campus's neighborhood with less than a high school degree, a lower average Index 1 accountability score, and a lower percent of Asian students. And these 4 factors predicted a campus's percent of ELs who became LTEL with high accuracy. For this study, we examined 3 cohorts of EL students who began first grade at 427 Houston area campuses in the 2012-13, 2013-14, and 2014-15 school years. A campus's percent of ELs who became LTEL were determined based on the students who started at that campus and remained in Texas public schools 5 years later. Campus averages of several key campus and neighborhood factors were created based on the school years that these 3 EL cohorts attended these campuses, so specifically the years 2013 through 2019. We used multiple regression analyses to examine the association between these key campus and neighborhood factors and a campus's percent of ELs who became LTELs. To account for students moving schools, parallel analyses were conducted only for students who stayed at the same elementary campus all 5 years, and results were very similar. Of the numerous campus and neighborhood factors included in these analyses, there were 4 significant factors. 2 factors were associated with a higher percent of ELs who became LTEL, and 2 factors were associated with a lower percent of ELs who became LTEL. First, for factors associated with a higher percent of LTELs, elementary campuses with a larger percent of students in bilingual and ESL programs, as displayed in the horizontal axis, had a higher percent of ELs who became LTEL, as displayed in the vertical axis. In other words, as a campus's percent of bilingual and ESL students increased, the campus's percent of ELs who became LTEL increased. It's important to note that for each factor, we are showing the values on the horizontal axis that represented most campuses in these analyses. In other words, most campuses had a percent of bilingual and ESL students between 15 and 65%. Second, campuses with a higher percent of neighborhood residents with less than a high school degree had a slightly higher percent of ELs who became LTELs. As the percent of residents in the campus's neighborhood with less than a high school degree increased, the percent of ELs who became LTELs at that campus slightly increased. Next, there were 2 factors that were associated with a lower percent of ELs who became LTEL at a campus. First, campuses with a higher average campus Index 1 accountability score had a lower percent of ELs who became LTEL. As the average campus Index 1 score increased, the percent of ELs who became LTEL decreased. Again, we're showing you the values that represented most campuses in these analyses on the horizontal axis. So most campuses had an average Index 1 score between 63 and 77. Second, campuses with a higher percent of Asian students had a lower percent of ELs who became LTEL. So as the campus's percent of Asian students increased, the percent of EL students who became LTEL decreased. To summarize, the higher percent of students in bilingual and ESL programs, the higher percent of ELs who became LTEL at that campus. In addition, the higher percent of residents in a campus's neighborhood with less than a high school degree was associated with a higher percent of ELs who became LTEL. Two campus factors that were associated with a lower percent of ELs who became LTEL were a higher average campus index 1 score and a higher percent of Asian students. And again, these 4 factors predicted a campus's percent of ELs who became LTEL with high accuracy. These findings bring us to a few implications. Looking at campuses helps us better understand the context where more ELs are becoming LTELs. And identifying campuses that reflect these 4 characteristics may help guide decisions about where to allocate resources for our ELs. However, these results do not tell us why schools differ in the percent of ELs who become LTELs. And most of these key factors are beyond the schools and districts' control. So further research would need to help us understand the practices and processes that are leading to these differences. For next steps, we will examine if campuses with a higher percent of ELs who become LTEL are geographically clustered around the Houston area. Then we will investigate several student-level research questions, including what predicts an individual EL student becoming LTEL, and importantly, what are the outcomes of LTEL students in middle and high school? Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, Lizzie Casciola, at the email address on the screen. And we look forward to sharing additional results from the long-term English Learner Study with you soon.